Good morning, everybody. I'm the one right before lunch, so lucky me and everything. I won't feel offended if 30 minutes in you're like, all right, I'm hungry, type of thing. But today we're talking about PCI. Woo. No? So obviously there's been a big change with PCI. In March, they released a new one. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of what the changes are, how could it impact the environment, things of that nature. Before that, I'm Justin Leapline. I've been involved in and out of consulting. I've worked at a number of companies where I had to deal with PCI. I've worked for an acquirer, I've worked for an issuer, worked for e-commerce, you name it. I've probably done the standard within PCI. I ran the PCI practice at TrustedSec for about 6 years. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that stuff. Working right now, I'm actually self-employed, working on a product for a GRC tool for smaller companies. I'm an Allianz faculty, and I actually just this week launched up a coffee roasting company. So like I didn't have enough time, to do anything else. I figured I'd do something else here. So let's get started. So first off, we're not going to talk about in-depth PCI, all this stuff. There's plenty of resources out there. We're going to strictly focus on the delta of what 4.0 is bringing to the table. So if it deals with that and what they're changing and everything, we're going to be talking about that. If it's the rest of PCI, how it impacts scope and everything, we're going to touch a little bit on scope, but more how it's changing with it. The text that I'm going to have, it's going to be pretty nerdy, kind of bulleted out with this, but my intention to this is that you'll take this as a resource, bring it to your company, and then you can use it as kind of a checklist for when PCI actually comes to fruition, you'll be able to kind of checkbox it off within your environment and do this. So keep that in mind. Also, too, from photos perspective, I have links at the end, so you can take a picture of that, download the full presentation, so you don't have to take pictures all the way through, just as an FYI. All right, so what has changed? So they added 64 new controls into 4.0. So 3.2.1 was out there for years. Now with 4.0, they're adding a ton of new controls. For merchants, there's 53 of them with that, and then service provider, there's 11 that are strictly for service providers. And if you don't know what the difference are, merchants is if you're swiping the card and that money is going directly into your pocket, you're a merchant, and a service provider is you're providing services for companies that are doing that. So an AWS would be a service provider for merchants that are being hosted within AWS. Now, there's a lot of different deadlines to this. Immediate, when we say immediate, is the first time you're using PCI 4.0 as an attestation document, so whether you're doing SAQ or whether you're doing a full-blown ROC, immediate is the first time you're using the 4.0 standard to submit for your attestation. Those controls become immediately effective when you're first using that. But there's a lot of forward-dated controls as well, and they are best practices all the way up to March 31st of 2025. So there's plenty of time for this. So there's different varied degrees to that. So first off, one of the big changes is a customized approach. So what is the customized approach? So they have basically what they call the defined standard, which is the typical stuff. The stuff that's already in there, they say you should do it this way, the straight PCI one. The customized approach replaces the compensating controls. So if you're familiar with compensating controls, they are, I can't do it exactly the way PCI is telling me. I have a business limitation, whether it be financially to put it in, technically to put it in, and now I basically have to come up with here's how I'm kind of getting around it. So if you can encrypt on your mainframe, you have to make it really hard to even get into your mainframe to get that data. That would be an example of a compensating control with that. So they got rid of that. There is no limitation on for you to be able to use that. You can use customized approach whenever you want to. Say there's a new technology that's all behavioral AI and it eliminates all viruses from all systems, but it doesn't technically meet any of the directly with that. You can actually produce a customized control, say this is why it's better. We've done a risk assessment. Here's where it goes, type of thing. So in this, if you see kind of in the requirements here, they have the defined approach. That's a standard, control with that. But then they have the customized approach objective. So if you're producing a customized approach, a custom kind of design to accomplish that objective, this is what you're aiming to accomplish with this. Now, I will say, reading through some of these, they're not the best description of these. Like sometimes they just reiterate what the defined approach is. It's not really the objective of like keeping bad guys out or not exploiting malware or something like that. They're just like, you know, MFA, you should have MFA. You know, it's like, okay, well, what's the actual like objective is to keep unauthorized people out, you know, type of thing. They're just saying like, you need more than one factor as the objective. So it'd be interesting to see as QSAs, we got a while until QSAs start to interpret this, to see how they actually read into this, because right now the customized approach is essentially you need more than one factor. So if you're not doing initially the 841, you need more than one factor, you still need more than one factor with that. But you can see they do the applicability approach. This is where they do like sometimes limitations into it. So you'll see things in the applicability notes that they'll say, you know, this doesn't apply to point of sale systems, or this is only for this type of accounts and everything. So these are good things that kind of reference as you're implementing some of the controls. So what if you want to do a customized approach? Customized approach sounds great. You know, can't meet it directly. I have this new innovative product, or I can't meet, you know, the direct control into this. It's a little bit of work to actually get to that. First off, you have to fill out a control matrix template, which is basically outlining what you're accomplishing with this control, the testing requirements and plan that you have with that, with it. You have to do a targeted risk analysis, which we're going to be talking about later. They have a lot of that through now the new requirements. You have to perform your testing. Now you can offset some of this to QSA companies or consulting companies, but you're going to pay for that, obviously, you know, with it. Most of the QSA companies I've heard of, when you're going through, especially with a ROC, they're going to be charging extra for any type of customized approach control that you have into it. So I've heard people, they haven't fully implemented this, you know, but if you have a customized approach, it's going to be a $ per customized approach added to your cost with that. So just keep that in mind. And then maintaining evidence, and then you're going to have to retain that evidence, and the assessor is going to have to look over all of that stuff to be able to approve that customized approach. So some of the templates with this, so this would be the control matrix. You can see kind of what requirements, describe it, you know, control implemented, control performed. A lot of extra work, you know, to kind of fill this out. You know, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you kind of get the gist of like, it's not just like, hey, I'll flip this, you know, and it'll be all good. There's a lot of work to actually, if you're serious about, to actually implement something along those lines. And then the targeted risk analysis, they give a template also for this, where it goes through kind of similar to the compensating control worksheet. Identify what you're doing, what's the proposed solution, all that stuff. One of the things I'd love out of this is 1.3, describe the mischief that the requirement was designed to prevent. I mean, you know, as some English person that like threw that language in, like you almost think like, oh yeah, it's some like evil guy with a mustache, you know, with this. You could just hear him laughing in the background. But what's even funnier to this, if you actually go to the definition of mischief, like right there in the middle, they give an example of the mischief is an absence of policy. And I'm like, is that really a mischief thing? Like, so yeah, it's kind of wonky the way they kind of describe, you know, some of these things here. But, you know, the goal of it is like if there's a lack of control, you know, into it, and looking at that from that perspective there. Anyway, back to the here. So yeah, identify the requirement, describe the proposed solution to it. It goes on to analyze the likelihood. So it actually is a targeted risk assessment. You are evaluating on impact, likelihood, everything along that lines. You know, now it's not a great calculation. I mean, honestly, 3.3, you just check the box on, is it more likely? Is it the same? Is it less likely? Type of thing. PCI kind of allows you to do whatever into that. So, and the way I know the QSA industry is they'll probably just allow that as your risk assessment, you know, if you fill out this sheet with it. And then changes to it, and then risk approval has to go up to executive management to approve all this stuff. And keep in mind, we'll see in the controls later, this has to be redone every single year for all your customized approach. So it's it can be good. Like if you're trying to do something in the cloud or there's some product, that you really want to utilize, not fitting in directly within PCI, this can give you flexibility with it, but it's not short of actually the work that you would also have to do to actually implement some of this stuff. So just keep that in mind. Another thing too that we've kind of seen this coming, if you're familiar, the cardholder data environment, was the typical definition of systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. That's how we define cardholder data. Now they're also defining cardholder data that are basically in the same kind of unfettered network access to around systems that touch cardholder data. Now, you'd say, Justin, those systems are already in scope. They're around that without any unrestricted network access. The problem is they were classified as system components. And there are a handful of controls within PCI that actually call out on CDE devices, like administering CDE devices with two-factor authentication internally with that. Now this kind of expands the scope. Other thing too is that say you have a shared services environment, and you have Active Directory into it or some other shared services that's providing service into the CDE. If you don't have, according to the QSA or whoever's assessing that, good enough network access controls between those down to what's business justified, you could basically turn that system into a CDE, and then all of a sudden that system spreads to every other system in that network as well. So keep in mind, like QSAs, as they're looking at this, it could expand scope quite drastically, and it really comes down to how that definition of network access and down to business justified. This was something that they introduced in the guidance documentation a few years ago. And one of the things we did with our customers is said, well, guidance document, it had a disclaimer at the bottom of every single page, said this isn't the standard. And it actually contradicted what the actual 321 standard actually said. Now they're basically pulling it from the guidance, implement it for sure in the standard here. So just keep that in mind there. So new requirements. This is where we're going to spend most of our time. And I like answering questions, so if there's any confusion or just want to get a clarification, let's do this right in the middle, just catch my eye and everything. So first off, they've added pretty much in every single section, roles and responsibilities, performing activities in requirement whatever, are documented, assigned, and understood. So they kind of had this in requirement 1. They actually reworded just to be this for the network sections with this. That's why that asterisk is kind of there. But the rest ones, they added this. So you can accomplish this either through policy documentation, assigning a team to particular services, RACI charts, in a wiki, something along that lines. More documentation you have to do to show all these controls into it. And the way I kind of have this, applies to all entities, so that's merchants and service providers. And then the effective is immediate. So as soon as you use 4.0 as at a station base, you have to have this done. Other documentation with this, you have to, with your retention, with any SAD data, keep in mind this is more to issuers if they're retaining SAD data. You have to have a way to actually clean that up on whatever your retention policy is. So in card production, which I worked a little bit in that time frame, it's typically 30 days. You're allowed to store that information for 30 days, and then you have to have a way to remove it. So that's basically just calling it out into the DSS that there should be a way to actually remove some of that stuff. There has to be technical controls that you can't just remove PANs through remote access technology. Essentially what this means is DLP. There can be other potential technical means where you might be able to limit access to DBA individuals and other controls that you accomplish this, but essentially this is calling out DLP, for if people have access to cardholder data, they're not pulling it over the VPN and putting it on their local computer with that. Another one from a documentation standpoint, you have to define your cryptographic architecture. So if you have any soft HSMs, certificates, anything like that, all has to be documented, has to be clear to where your keys are stored, where it's being encrypted, all that stuff and everything. And this is for service providers only. But keep in mind, the common rule for service providers only, for this version is service providers only. For the next version, it'll probably be for merchants too. For all entities, they have to have an inventory of all your trusted keys and certificates. So there has to be a documentation pointing to where everything is, within your environment for PCI. Another thing that's going to be a little bit bigger, you're going to have an inventory of all your software and all your third-party stuff. So that's custom applications, third-party libraries that you're doing. So if you've followed NIST, the bill of materials that they've been saying, all that stuff will have to be documented and producible to the assessor, as well as any third-party products that you're installing, onto your environment that has to be patched into this. And then lastly, on the documentation, suites and protocols in use and documented and reviewed. So, your TLS certificate, what's the cipher suites that you're using, what's the protocols you're allowed with that. Obviously, you can pull that, but now you have to have a formal document. So here's our approved, TLS 1.2, AES 256, whatever that may be. Some encryption stuff. So SAS or electronic prior to completion, both 3.3.2 and 3.3.3 are issuers that apply to. So if you're storing SAD, you have to protect it, strong encryption with that. They didn't directly call that out in previous. They're basically just filling in the blanks, to some of this stuff. Hash is used, this is a big one. Hash is used to render PANs unreadable. Have to use salt now. You can't just have a straight hash for your PANs. With that, it has to be salted to when it's storing in the back end. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, that's great, to be able to do that and everything, which it is, but there are potential things that could actually impact that. Whereas, if you're a grocery store chain and you're looking for duplicate card numbers, it's now hard for you to actually just look in a hash table and say, is it a duplicate hash in there? Because everything's salted, into that perspective. So just keep in mind, this could impact some processes depending on how you're using that hash. Another big one, they specifically call out in 3512 that you're not allowed to just rely on disk or partition level encryption as your encryption source unless it's a removable drive. So if it's a USB drive, backup tapes, something along that lines, you can rely on, full disk encryption-ish, with that. But you're not allowed to just store your documents that contain cardholder data on an S3 encrypted bucket. That's not allowed. It has to be another layer of encryption onto that that's at the file level with them. And then certificates over just can't be expired, with this. So I guess they had some problems with this, at 421. They're specifically just calling out, it can't be expired, even though it might still go over TLS 1.2 and get a warning on the consumer. They're saying, it needs to be a valid cert. So this is one of the things that we talked about with periodic reviews. So one of the most common terms that they've added into this is a targeted risk analysis. So I showed you the example, they kind of gave it and broke it down on what they would do for a customized approach. Now, a lot of the things, if you remember with 321, there was a lot of things that came out like you have to periodically review your gas station pumps to make sure that there's no tampering or substitution. You have to periodically review whatever. There was a number of components into this. Now they're basically, a lot of the stuff they're either calling out, specifically like you have to do this every 7 days, or do a targeted risk analysis to define your own number, or they'll just call out you need to do a targeted risk analysis. So keep in mind, this has to be reviewed annually and approved by executive management for each one of these. So targeted risk analysis on any systems you deem not applicable to malware protection. So Linux systems, let's say you don't install any AV on Linux systems, you have to do a targeted risk analysis on an annual basis to say, yes, they're still out of scope for anti-malware. The frequency of malware scans, they call out continuous, in the standard now. But if you have an alternate, like you're scanning weekly, you have to have a targeted risk analysis. inspections on point of interaction device, point of sale devices, and then the determining of the frequency of log reviews and on all other system components. You have to review it all on the CDE, but you have flexibility when it has outside systems with that. And then on how frequently the targeted risk analysis, so this is has to be performed to review that, and then met with the customized approach. That's 3.1, 3.2, what we talked about with that. And then periodic training for incident response personnel. You have flexibility on, how often you do that to individuals. So there's a lot of work with this. We'll talk about at the end, like outside of some of the technical controls and limitations that they're implementing in this, a lot of this stuff comes from more resources internally and potentially externally on helping you basically just maintain your security program and building it up to where it needs to be for 4.0. Luckily, we got some time, but yeah, there's a lot of work to kind of do this. Going on further outside of the target risk analysis, periodic reviews. Now they're adding in, you have to review user accounts and access privileges appropriately. That wasn't a thing in PCI before. Now it's SOX world all over again. You have to review your access, on a regular basis. They're adding in system and application accounts. Before, PCI didn't really touch on this. QSAs were kind of like, hey, it shouldn't degrade the security. Like you could just don't set the accounts to password, type of thing. Now they're specifically calling out that application and system accounts are in scope and they should also be reviewed with that. Hardware and software technologies are reviewed. So one of the requirements is putting together a list of all your hardware and software. One of the main things that kind of call this out is like when's end of life. So if you're using some Windows system 2012, you're supposed to document like when is end of life for this system. And the QSA assessor, whoever it is, takes that and reviews it to make sure that you're all within supported area, or have a customized approach, that you could also do with them. 12.5.2 kind of was a requirement. So if you're ever going through and doing a ROC, up in the top section, the kind of requirement 0, as we called it, actually called out you had to review your scoping and confirm it each year. Now they're basically putting this as a specific requirement, so you can write verbiage directly to that. And then the significant organization changes with that, and this is service provider only, you basically have to review that and communicate to executive management. Sorry, repeat one, and then security awareness program has to review it every 12 months and update as needed, so you can't use the same stuff that you used for like 5 years now. It has to be updated. We'll actually cover a little bit that they have added phishing as a requirement into this as well. And then this is for SP only. If you're logging into multiple customers, there has to be a separation between the different customers. You can't just be connected to all customers at the same time, type of thing. All right, monitoring. So one of the bigger things that was also added in is monitoring your payment page for like changes on all the scripts and everything. So this is content security policy. If you're familiar with this, outlining where you're getting your scripts from. If there's any remote scripts you're doing, you're pulling them appropriately. It has to be hashed, so you have to verify the integrity of it. There's a lot of work into that. And keep in mind, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but they even add this into the SAQs as well, and even into SAQA. This is one of the additional requirements into SAQA, which is basically have outsourced almost everything. This is one of those ones, if you're doing an e-commerce page, you'll have to make sure that you have a content security policy. No longer can you have the option to do manual review of logs or automated review. They're just calling out automated review of logs, which is a good thing because my firm opinion, nobody really does manual review of logs. And when we say manual review of logs, we're basically talking about you going into your syslog server and looking at the logs and validating that there's nothing wrong. Nobody's really doing that, type of thing. There's some type of automated triggering system and triaging of those. That's what they're calling out. Is like there has to be some SIM that's raising alarms that you're triaging in that respect there. A lot of things that they got in 3 is looking at your security controls and calling out when they failed. They're adding things to that if certain controls failed, you're notified and deal with it accordingly. So critical security control systems are alerted, detected, and addressed promptly and responded to promptly. And then 11, they call out that you have to detect through IDS, IPS, some other means, EDR, that there's convert malware communication channels. So, C2, with that, and just looking at that and detecting and doing that. That's SP only right now, but again, it's only a matter of time before it comes merchants as well. And then change in tampering detection mechanisms is deployed for payment pages, so specifically on the payment page. And it calls out once a week, or you can define it through a targeted risk analysis. You basically have to look at your payment page and see if it's changed and do something if you didn't expect it to change. So some type of monitoring and kind of hashing of that page and detecting whether it's changed without you being aware of the change to production. And then failures, this is, a couple of additions, automated log review mechanisms, have to alert on the failure of those, and then code review tools have to look at the failure of that. So if you have a DevSecOps pipeline and it's running to look at third-party packages, static code analysis, if that fails, you need to be alerted that it has failed. Do we need a break here? I mean, there's a lot. And like I said, my intention for this is to give this to whoever wants it, and that way you can have kind of your checklist to go through and utilize it on the off. So yeah, the timeframes are, nice that we got a lot of time, but I wouldn't wait because there's a lot of little things that need to be done within the next couple of years for this. So I think we're almost done here. We've got a couple more sections. So vulnerability, anti-malware. Look at electronic media. So when you plug in a USB drive, it has to scan it. Most solutions have that nowadays, so it shouldn't be too big a deal. They're just calling it out. Mechanisms are placed to detect phishing with that. So that means email protection. On some of the phishing perspective, this wasn't called out before. Now you have to have a way to detect certain phishing stuff. You could probably do it through some EDR aspects as well, but this is one of the things that you'll need to measure with it. Automated technical solutions, so WAFs are now required. Before it was a kind of, you can do an application assessment once a year or do a WAF. Now WAFs are required, with anything that's public facing that takes cardholder data. Manage all other application vulnerabilities. They're specifically calling out application vulnerabilities that aren't high or critical risk. So you have to manage them. They're not necessarily calling out that you have to fix them, but you have to have an active program to manage. You can't say medium below whatever, type of thing. There has to be a kind of a determination on, are we gonna fix it, are we not, what's a risk to the organization. Another big one that's changing, no longer that vulnerability scans can be just network-based. It's either agent-based or credentialed-based. Obviously, my preference is agent-based, but you can have the option to do credentials around with that. And then 11.4.7, multi-tenant service providers support their customers for external penetration testing. This basically came about, there's, some bigger players, but they've modified a lot, but there's some smaller players that if you have a remote hosting data center or something like that, they would oh, you're not allowed to scan us, you're not allowed to do a penetration, even though it was your site. And then it was well, are you doing the penetration test then? No, that wasn't part of our contract. So they're basically calling out, if you're a multi-tenant service provider, you have to support your customers if they want to do a penetration test, and just calling it out verbatim into that. Identity and access control. So this was a little bit of one where they've intermixed some of the NIST 800 changes into it for good for most of it. Some of it they didn't really change as much as I would like, but so you have to manage, we mentioned application system accounts, into this. You have to do a minimal level of complexity for passwords when used as an authenticate factor. That's now up to 12 with that. They do allow an exception for systems that don't support up to 12, aka mainframes, type of thing, and it has to be at the maximum of that with it. They actually specifically called that out in 836. They still have that passwords are the only authentication piece. It has to be changed every 90 days. You can adjust that with a targeted risk analysis, but they still have the default 90 days if it's a single factor to log into that. If it's multi-factor, so if you're going into your cloud environment and it's always through multi-factor, you could up that to a year, that you don't have to change it, or maybe not indefinitely. You can also put in other factors where you look at where the account is coming from. So if they're logging in from Nigeria and they never logged in from Nigeria, then that would do some extra flags. So you have some flexibility in actually implementing some of this stuff. Multi-factor authentication for all access into the CDE with this. So that was one thing that they added, that anytime you're going into the CDE, you have to have multi-factor access. The change from the last system, all they had was administrative access. This is basically anybody logging in. So if it's a accounting person logging into a system that have a spreadsheet of cardholder data, probably a bad idea, but example with that, they have to do multi-factor. So mainframe access may have to do multi-factor if they have a green screen that is going through and showing full card data and everything. Yep. Yep. So the question was, just to repeat it, does that include web applications with it? The answer is, if you can see full card data onto it, the answer is yes with it. Now, keep in mind, I believe it's this requirement here in one of those applicable notes. They say it's not applicable to ones that only can see one card number at a time type of thing. So if I'm a point of sale, with that, I'm just entering in one card at a time, it's not applicable to those. But if you have a web application that can look at a spreadsheet of card data, and say you're dealing with chargebacks or something like that, that would be a applicable control. Good question. Multi-factor access on systems that are implemented appropriately. So just making sure that you can't escape around it. I know the PCI Council had a big problem at one point that they had the multi-step authentication. They said both factors had to be authenticated at the same time, which is really hard to do when you're doing like push notifications for it. They've loosened up a little bit if you actually read the requirement, but they want to make sure that you can't escape around one of the factors, essentially when it comes down to it. Manage interactive logins for accounts used by systems or applications. So if you use a system or an application account that's used for back-end stuff, if that is able to do interactive access, like it's going over SSH or going into the application can perform other functions, you need to manage those appropriately. Same kind of thing, with the addition of application and system accounts, they're putting in all this stuff to say, okay, you need to protect against misuse, so monitoring what they're doing, no escalate, proper privileges fall into this. With that, application and system accounts, so with that. And then multi-tenant confirms access to any customer environment is logically separated. So this is SP only, but again, the same kind of component with separating out that access, between your different customers. And then I think lastly, no, we have a miscellaneous one right at the end. A little bit on incident response. That one, you have to do change and tamper detection mechanism. So we mentioned that if your payment page changed, you should actually incorporate into your incident response plan how to deal with that. So different things like that. If something's tamper detected, you need to have a response in your incident response plan how to do that. So a playbook would work, specific to that. And then incident response plan procedures are initiated upon detection of PAN outside of the CDE scope. So if you detect PAN in your share drives, and it's not supposed to be there, you need to have a plan to say, okay, we need to and analyze full scope, look at permissions, who had permissions with that, is there any, copying that was done, with that education, just kind of writing up something like that. And then have something, this is multi-tenant service providers for, basically this is a bug bounty thing, so if you're a service provider and your customers find bugs, you need to have a way to deal with them. And then a couple other things we mentioned, phishing and related and social engineering attacks. That's a specific call out that now QSAs will be looking for that within your training with it. And then training about acceptable uses of end user technologies. So that was always kind of called out in the acceptable use in requirement 12. Now they're calling that for the training annually as well. And then third-party service providers, support the customer's requests to this. Whenever they're asking about their compliance, you need to respond to them. All right, take a deep breath. We're through the requirements here. Got a couple other small things. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're good on time. All right. So SAQs. So one of the things that's they're adding to SAQs, if you're an SAQ fill out, not only are they adding like all the controls that we just mentioned into this, but they're also adding things that were already existing controls. One of the biggest ones that I've seen so far is that now SAQAs, which is basically like 20, 30, I think it's 36 controls, and a lot of that is physical because they can still take faxes, under this type. Now they're adding that you have to do ASV scans. So basically almost every type has to do an ASV scan. This is gonna blow it up to a lot of different merchants that have never done ASV scans before and probably have never run a vulnerability scan as well in their life. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of grows, into the industry. Because one of the biggest things we'll talk about in just a second is people missing their ASV, timeline. You're supposed to scan that quarterly, at least quarterly. If you miss that, all of a sudden it's a ding into your PCI. And report on compliance, ROCs. So these are the level 1, sometimes level 2 merchants and service providers into this. So obviously we talked about they did away with the compensating control worksheet. But that was one of the sections that they did. Now they replaced that, and now they have in place with the remediation. So what happens if you're doing a customized approach? That's just in place. They consider that if that's all good and your customized approach, that's an in-place control. So what is in place with remediation? So in place with remediation is anytime the assessor finds a ding against you, they're going to expect you to correct it, and then they'll put it in place with the remediation with a description of why they marked you with in place with remediation. Now, what will this have as an impact? Probably nothing, type of thing. If you're compliant at the end of the day and you fix whatever problems, that's fine, type of thing. But like some of the biggest things that when we're doing ROCs for customers, missing ASV scans, that was one of the biggest things. We had our kind of set company policy with this, but it was all over the place from a QSA standpoint. Like I've even heard some things like ridiculous, like we missed, last quarter's ASV scan because the guy that was doing them just left and nobody picked it up. So now we're going to do, and I had a QSA tell me once, it's like, well, I guess you got to wait for a year to get compliant because you're missing one QSA or one ASV scan and you need to have 4 quarters, type of thing. It's not the way PCI was designed with this. Now they have a specific way. They essentially will do, they want to make sure you have to be fixed, with this. So the QSA just say, oh, you missed just the last one? Oh, okay, that's fine, type of thing. You have to run another scan with this. You have to have a remediation to cover why that failed, whatever that may be. And then the QSA will review that, accept it, and put it in place with remediation, noting that there were issues with it, but that you fixed it, type of thing. And so some of the other stuff that unintentional storage of like PAN outside the CDE, missing policies, missing networks, basically anything that wasn't compliant right out of the start, they're supposed to turn it into an in-place remediation. So, and then here's a little bit of like just the heading. So one of the things to keep in mind, QSAs are going to have a lot more documentation work. This is one control, and you don't start writing up control until right at the very end. All the top part is just filler information. So first off, it's the selection of the boxes. Then it goes into, describe why the assessment finding was selected. And quite honestly, it's kind of worthless if it's in place. It's like, because everything checked out. Like I got the evidence, everything looked good. Now it might change in place with remediation or not in place. You can describe like some of the stuff, but literally you have to describe why you selected that, which I think is kind of a worthless, type of thing. You can describe it down below. And then you have to basically say, a customized approach or compensating control used, into this for the defined or customized approach with this. So yeah, it's a little messy. The biggest thing to get out of this, you wouldn't be filling this out. This would be a QSA company, but they're going to charge you for this. So I've heard some estimates it's going to be like 30% more to what you're paying right now for 4.0, plus or minus, with this. And then it's even more if you're doing customized approach. So just keep that in mind that when this actually comes down into being implemented, there's going to be some price hikes into it. So lastly, to close up here, a little bit of pros and cons. So the customized approach I like. That gives a lot of flexibility to merchants and service providers to actually do some of this stuff. Some of the controls were actually improved, to the way they implemented. I think some of the stuff that, monitoring logs, nobody really did it good manually, so like just eliminate that, type of thing. Adding more monitoring capabilities, which, if you don't have a good monitoring program in place, it's not if, it's when, oftentimes. So adding more monitoring stuff into it, I think is a good thing. And it eliminates some of the QSA discretion. It was way back, but I did a presentation on PCI 3.0. One of my slides was actually slamming how bad it was of them doing periodically. Like they just added a whole bunch of periodically words into it. Now with the targeted risk analysis, they're at least taking it out of the QSA's discretion and putting it back into the company and saying, here's what we think this means, and here's our risk analysis to support that. So that's a good thing. The cons are this going to be way more work from a documentation standpoint. A number of controls are added. It's going to be higher costs, both from an internal resource and from external costs if you have to pay for that. And then you're adding control levels to the SAQs that I think from a smaller company, I've worked with companies that are like 3 people, doing nonprofit volunteer work and everything. Now you're asking them to go get an ASV scan. They're going to be lost, and they're going to need a lot of help with this to do some of that stuff and everything. So that's it. So I made a Notion site, but that was way too long. They both go to the same place. So if you want to take pictures of that, yeah, it's fine. And actually, I did not buy this domain just right now. I've had this for like 5 years. So, but I figured I'd spare you the big hash at the end. So, yeah. So the requirement to when you have to use 4.0 is March 31st, 2024. That's when you have to, well, it's actually April 1st type of thing. But you have until 2024 to still use 3.2.1. Then you'll be required to use 4.0. And then you have another year for those forward-dated controls to implement those and everything. If you're using if you don't have those controls in place in that in-between time, it's not applicable if you put it there, if you don't have it in place. If you have it in place, you can just mark it in place. So, yeah. Immediate is, like today, you can actually file with 4.0, but a lot of people aren't choosing that because there's a lot of immediate controls. Like as soon as you file with the 4.0 templates, you have to do all those immediate controls, type of thing. So that's why nobody's really filing with 4.0 right now, but there could be some later this year, next year, type of thing that, as they're building up, if they already have those all in place, they'd be like, okay, yeah, let's start the transition into that type of thing. Yeah. Yeah, so there are a number of ones. I'd actually recommend they have a summary of changes that they kind of break down. Yeah, it's awful. And honestly, I dove a lot into this for the presentation, But every standard, it always surprised me. Like they're like, oh, we just modified for clarity, and then you look at the verbiage, you're like, well, that changes the definition, type of thing. I haven't seen too many of those, as of now, type of thing that really substantially change it to like, oh man, this is really in scope. Like one of the things they eliminated was the anti-malware should be on commonly affected. They eliminated that verbiage. They basically said it should be on all systems, except for the ones that like another control says, except for the ones that aren't really, done, but you have to do a targeted risk analysis. So kind of like it covers it under the terms, but they modify the verbiage, type of thing. But yeah. Yeah, Matt.
Hey, Justin, first, great presentation.
Thank you.
Especially the insight about not relying on S3 bucket encryption.
Yeah.
On top of the encryption.
Yep.
Hey, just I'm curious, microsegmentation. I know PCI requires network segmentation.
Yep.
Has it weighed in on microsegmentation and the appropriate approach for network segmentation?
So they did a kind of a cloud guidance, and it calls out some of the segmentation controls into there. But PCI does like, they want to basically get hands off on technology and talking about that. They basically talk about principles of like, okay, least privilege, limited to only necessary, traffic, all that stuff and everything. Microsegmentation is great, especially if you can automate the maintenance of that, type of thing. But it really just comes down to, it's still segmentation at the end of the day, into that. So yeah, nothing directly, but the guidance, they made a cloud guidance document that comes the closest to that.
PCI is not prescriptive.
Correct.
Suggest that you'll need some sort of segmentation, isolation of certain services.
Yep.
That leaves it up to the
Yeah.
control solution.
Yep. So my recommendation on that, if you are shopping around for QSAs, look for somebody that's very familiar with cloud technology. I've seen some, and nothing slamming, a lot of that. I've had like ex-cops come in and try to look at like my acquiring information on a mainframe. He never saw a mainframe before. Same thing goes for cloud. Like you get some QSAs and sometimes if they're soft, it's all right. Like, okay, here's our controls, and as long as they're okay with it, sometimes that's all right. But if they start giving you hard nose, like, I don't understand, like, how is it really segmented? Show me your ACLs, and it's like, oh no, the rules are right here. Oh, I don't see where it's allowing port whatever. It's like, well, no, type of thing. That's where you need to make sure you have a good partner if they're assessing it in your environment. So, okay, out of time. Thank you, everyone. Come and get me if you have any more questions.